future trends, deep insights, industry leaders. This is the iGaming Next podcast with your host, Pierre Lindh.
Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are, Martin. You're on the east coast of the United States. How are you doing today?
Hello, Pierre. Thanks for having me. First of all, it's always a pleasure. I've been doing very fine, or as the Americans would put it, I've been very good. How have you been?
Well, I've been very, very fine as well, thank you, Martin. It was a long time ago now. We did a podcast last time. It was in the very early inception of this podcast history when we linked up through this podcast. And I've been an avid follower of yourself since then, of course. And it's always nice to have you back here as one of the, I would say, the top experts on regulatory movements of the iGaming industry, and specifically on the US side of things here, where you are obviously in charge of American regulatory affairs and responsible gambling over at Entain.
You're very kind. I'm happy that I've made, albeit a very small contribution to your podcast, that since its early days shot to fame. And I've been, to return the compliment, I've been an avid follower not only of the podcast but of yours. So I'll say it once again, it's great to be here, and hello to everybody from the East Coast.
Brilliant. Well, Martin, let's jump straight into it. I've been really excited to do this podcast together again, specifically to zoom in on the current landscape from a regulatory perspective in the North American market. And I guess as a starting point here today, it would just be really interesting to hear from your perspective, kind of what are the most interesting regulatory discussions that are taking place in the North American market at the moment? Are there any particular states that you are keeping a very close eye on at the moment? Is there any particular insights that you can share with us here as a starting point today?
Well, cynically speaking, I could say that what states have not engaged with this space just yet, because perhaps the place to kick the answer to your question off is rather perhaps bizarrely and definitely surprisingly the great state of Hawaii. Because Hawaii, as you might know, as the audience might know, is one of the very few US states that currently offer no gambling opportunities, not even a lottery. And in the last couple of weeks, one of the Hawaiian legislator plucked up a courage and submitted a sports betting bill to the Hawaii legislature. So that was a bit of in all honesty, it was a bit of a surprise, as I've said. Unfortunately, that very legislature seems to have drawn more than a little bit of inspiration from what lately, moving from the very far, west, not even west coast, to the good old east coast, yes, drawn inspiration from what's been happening here in New York, and has been honest and kind enough to have admitted it, because the Hawaiian bill, long story short, includes a proposal to introduce a 55% GGR tax. Well, New York has 51. There are movements in Arkansas towards a 51%, equivalent of a GGR tax, because in Arkansas's case it would be a revenue share. So perhaps that's the place to start. But on a more general note, if I may, the US sports betting regulatory bonanza, if you will, keeps going strong. So Florida and New York State, including the great city of New York, right across the river from me, at the moment, they are the two of the four, for what I would call sleeping giants, that have woken up, i.e. the big US states, population rich, that historically, if 3 years of regulation counts as history, of course, that have historically been hesitant to regulate sports betting or mobile sports betting, because they've been very intently and keenly observing the happenings in the other states, including the likes of New Jersey, and now they've been jumping on the bandwagon. But besides those four, and happy to comment in a bit more detail on what's been going on in those four lately, I suppose at the risk of stating the obvious, other states have very recently launched their sports betting markets, be it Arizona, Louisiana, Ohio is in the throes of producing regulations that will implement the sports betting law that was adopted very late last year. And there are other states, such as Massachusetts, the home to my beloved Bruins and Patriots, of course, Maine, Georgia, Missouri, Kansas. So all these states, not a long story short, are very intently looking into regulating sports betting. And I believe, although I don't have a crystal ball, perhaps it's not necessarily needed, but I believe that in the next 2 years, some 40, perhaps even 45 US states will have regulated sports betting in one way or another. I suppose, never say never. We've talked about Hawaii. I suppose we can't really expect the Utahs and even, and the Alaskas of this world to regulate.
Yeah. Absolutely, and you mentioned here the long regulatory history of the 3 years back, and we talked earlier with a friend of mine. We said that we should count the years in the iGaming industry. We should count them as dog years. So 1 year in real life is 7 years in the iGaming world. So 3 years, you can say that it's about 2 decades in the normal world, approximately. Fast-moving, fast-paced industry, of course. But
indeed, that if I may put it that way, that particular regulatory puppy has grown up extremely quickly, and the New Jersey numbers, the New York numbers, the overall numbers, I was going to say market numbers, of course, it's individual markets, but the grand total is going through the roof. Yeah. And let's just hope that the growth will continue and that it will critically continue in a sustainable way.
Yeah, and you mentioned something interesting here, Martin. The fact that Hawaii, the proposed legislation here proposed a 55% tax rate. Obviously, we've seen New York here with a 51% tax rate that has been criticized from industry perspective. However, from tax perspective and from state level, I would assume that politicians over in New York see this as a success with the amount of extra tax revenue that has been generated, and the fact that operators have chosen to be so aggressive in that state, despite the tax hike in New York. So that begs a little bit the question here: are we seeing potentially that other legislators in the states look at New York and the tax rate that they are imposing on the operators and asking themselves, why wouldn't we impose a similar tax rate rather than, in the low 20s or in the teens even, that other states are implementing at the moment?
I believe that's a very fair question, and indeed that risk may be shaping up as we speak. At the same time, couple of points, if I may. At the same time, the New York regulation, and to your point, I would be the first one, or amongst the first ones, to praise the great efforts the likes of Senator Adobo and Assemblyman Pretlow, together with the New York State administration, put into the regulation and the whole process. And it's amazing that the state of New York has finally jumped on the bandwagon of allowing mobile sports betting. So that's the place to start. The other point I would make in that regard is that just like in any new market, I suppose in New York, given the stature of the place, both the state and the city, it's probably magnified, and I will not put a multiplier on it, but the hype factor and the novelty factor of the market is magnified. New York is a totemic state, so that's one of the reasons why the industry has so keenly, in my view, engaged with New York State. At the same time, I do believe that we need to be looking past that hype and that novelty factor and see how it pans out, at what level all these numbers will settle, and then hopefully that will give everybody involved a chance to look at those numbers and, I may be naive here, consider whether any tweaks may be required when it comes to the level of taxation. And I started this answer by talking about a risk. I believe there are two key risks. You're right in saying that it's absolutely great that mobile sports betting, on top of other gambling operations that are allowed or have already been allowed in the state of New York, generate this additional tax stake for the state of New York. However, such a high tax rate, unfortunately, may be conducive to persistence of the previously or currently existing black market, because I wouldn't be surprised if the black market operators were to take advantage of the fact that they are not subject to any statutory duties, including duties related to taxation. And hand in hand, unfortunately, hand in hand with this comes the fact that some customers, even a big-ish group of customers, may choose to literally vote with their feet and bet or even continue betting with these black market operators. Unfortunately, the black market operators are not, if I may put it that way, renowned for affording their customers appropriate levels of consumer protection, including those that extend to responsible gambling. So the point I'm really trying to make, that the other key risk on top of that financial risk that in my view is associated with that extremely high level of taxation and the resultant black market, is that those customers that will stay or move to the black market will not be protected, and part, if not a large part of the tax stake, may have to be expended on dealing with issues such as gambling addiction or even litigation matters, because these customers might have to take the black operators to court. So one thing is the great tax stake that has been generated, and that needs to be applauded. At the same time, to my mind, the critical issue that's linked to it is how that money can or how that money has to be spent.
Yeah, so I have a question on that, especially related to responsible gambling, and seeing that you are the SVP of American Regulatory Affairs and Responsible Gambling. The American operators, even the regulated ones, seemingly are very aggressive when it comes to acquiring customers, similar to the levels we've seen in Europe, in Scandinavia, for example, a number of years ago, where we don't see much of a focus on responsible gambling. It seems to be more a focus on aggressively acquiring customers. How do you marry those two ideas? The fact that you mentioned you had the black operators don't necessarily focus much on RG, but from a European perspective, perhaps some of the licensed American operators doesn't focus enough either on responsible gambling. What's your perspective here?
My view is that indeed a lot of work in this regard will need to be done, and it will have to come from within the industry. And the industry, in my view, has now seen much more light in this regard and is coming together gradually. Some people would go slowly. I would stick to the word gradually, because there has been significant movement to address responsible gambling issues. And don't get me wrong, I don't disagree with your points. Absolutely. The focus so far, given the overall novelty of sports betting in the United States, has been on customer acquisition. Lot of marketing money has been spent on attracting customers to the legalized channels, which is a good thing. Going back to our discussion about black market, it's also a good thing that the major leagues and other sports have engaged with this space. So there's been a lot of collaboration in that regard. But indeed, for the sake of the long-term sustainability of the US markets, sports betting markets and prospectively online casino markets, and happy to address that regulatory process as well.
Absolutely.
Of course. But for the sake of the long-term sustainability of the markets, I would strongly suggest that the industry as a whole, together with the responsible gambling advocates and others in this space, because being supported and willed on to do it by the regulators, we all do need to raise our game, learn lessons from what's been going on in Europe, and start applying even more intently those best practices. To give you but a few examples, Entain has been launching together with our partners from BetMGM in a number of instances. We've launched, I would like to think, quite a few initiatives that are focused on practical aspects of responsible gambling, on top of all the research that has already been done with great institutions such as the Division on Addiction of the Harvard Medical School, and also, of course, and most definitely, UNLV. Not to bore you with all the details, but the one or the couple I'm particularly excited about it are our tour with the Charles Oakley Foundation, because actually later today I'll be on the plane to Los Angeles, rather, where we will kick off the tour. We will be feeding the hungry, and we will be talking to the public at large about responsible gambling on the Super Bowl day. So that's one. And the tour will travel through the likes of Cleveland, 2 weeks in New York in early March, and then we'll be headed down south to New Orleans for the Final Four of the men's NCAA basketball tournament. The other one that I'd like to shout out, perhaps selfishly, is the Gamble Responsibly America app that we launched together with our great partners from RG 2024/7. So hopefully I'm painting a picture of the likes of Entain trying really to seize the opportunity that, in my view, America has to get on the front foot when it comes to addressing responsible, if you will, problem or sustainable gambling matters. But not to be selfish, not to just talk about Entain. Especially recently, the likes of DraftKings, MGM, Caesars, everybody's been engaging much more purposefully with this space. DraftKings have more than kindly committed to put forth additional funding for the state chapters of the National Council on Problem Gambling. Caesars have got the Manning brothers to produce a responsible gambling advert, a number of research projects that are being funded by MGM. And also to address the esports and gaming side of things together with DraftKings, together with Meta. I still want to call them Facebook. I think that name has a much more ring to it. Entain has engaged in forming the Global Gaming Alliance to address responsible gambling issues in the video gaming space. So another long story short, the bottom line is that I believe, put it plainly and bluntly, things are happening. We're now firmly on that path, on that journey to reach the responsible gambling nirvana, if I may call it that way. It will be a long and arduous journey. To your point, once again, I'll say it again, if I may, the industry does need to step up further, but I would argue that we are in a fairly different place than we would have been, including in the United States, even a year, 2 years ago.
Great, Martin. I have a question on the. You mentioned the charitable contributions here earlier in the reply, where you mentioned you're going to Los Angeles now during the Super Bowl weekend to feed the hungry, which is a fantastic initiative. The critics to the online gambling or to gambling industry in general say that charitable contributions from gambling companies is unethical, and many charitable organizations don't even accept donations from our industry. You're an academic man. You're very intelligent, Martin. Can I give you credit here?
I'll be blushing now. Thanks for the compliment.
Can you tell me what is the how like considering the criticism the industries sometimes get, what do you feel about the gambling industry making charitable contributions in general? Do you think that it's ethical for the industry to make such contributions when, on the other hand, there's also problems being generated from the industry?
And for that very reason, I strongly believe that it's an absolute necessity and that onus is on the industry to give back. And perhaps what sometimes misunderstood is the fact that the industry doesn't want to be profiting, if not profiteering, from gambling addicts. So yet another onus on the industry is to provide for efficient help and treatment for those who have unfortunately landed in the patch whereby they have contracted gambling addiction, because gambling addiction is a disease. So a large part of these contributions are spent not only on prevention, but also on treatment. There will always be criticism, and as I keep saying, the industry can do even better, but the industry is already doing a lot. So going back to my initial philosophical point, if you will, it's in industry's every interest, and I believe in that regard we're strongly aligned with the regulators, with the governments, even with the critics. We want our markets to be populated by happy customers. This may sound cheesy, but I will explain myself. Happy customer is a healthy customer. Healthy customer is a customer that keeps coming back to play in a reasonable, sustainable fashion. So these are the customers that our product is designed to attract. And at the same time, and that's where the whole technology shebang, if you will, comes in. Because the likes of Entain, few others, and I have every belief and confidence, perhaps be naive once again, that further down the track, the whole industry will jump on this bandwagon across the piece. In the UK, in Europe, in the United States, in the nascent Americas markets that we can, of course, talk about as well. The industry has, over the course of the last 3-4 years, been supported by academia, been supported by those who have unfortunately suffered from gambling addiction, create a whole portfolio of ever more efficient tools to prevent gambling addiction. We're going much, much further than, in all honesty, it's fair to say we would have gone in the past. To give you but a couple of examples, and I will stick to the Entain technology and the ARC program that we've been testing in the United Kingdom, and now we're rolling out across the country. We will be rolling out globally in the months and years to come. Now, we've got technology that allows us to, for example, intercept our sites while somebody who we've detected as having a potential problem, we will take over control. We will send that person towards our responsible gambling control center. We do recommend what we believe are the right tools for that person to bring his or her gambling behavior back on the right track. And if need be, if the only tool we can deploy to help that person is to close that person's account and put him on a treatment path, then we will not shy away from doing that. So to answer your initial point about the criticism, I believe these donations have a massive role to play because they support invaluable research, they support practical initiatives, such as gambling treatment centers. And at the same time, the industry has been heavily investing in technology. And I suppose the final point in that regard, we've also heavily invested in further training dedicated customer service agents who actually are no longer customer service agent in the traditional meaning of the word. They're dedicated, responsible, and problem gambling advisors. So another long story short, there's a lot of money on top of those donations or contributions that indeed every now and then attract criticism. But the overall package that I have just set out is, in my view, absolutely critical to the sustainable future of this industry.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the customer support agents, because they are obviously on the front lines, the individuals who meet often the customers with problems, and they have to deal with those conversations, of course. So it's interesting how you see the customer support agents as also trained in responsible gambling and being able to communicate and handle those type of contacts. I want to also ask you, Martin, you mentioned here the ARC system, which is Entain's AI-powered system to prevent harmful gambling. Kindred have implemented their own AI system to prevent harmful gambling as well, and they have gone out and said and committed themselves to eliminate their revenue from harmful gambling by 2023. Unfortunately, so far they have not really been able to make great strides here. They released a quarterly report today where they disclosed that from last year's 4% of the total revenue from potential harmful gambling, it's still 4% a year later, but they are still confident that they'll be able to reach this journey to zero. Now, Entain have been a little bit more conservative in the target, saying that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Martin, but Entain hasn't been wanting to commit themselves to a specific target, predominantly because of the risk of false positives that the systems can generate. But if we look into a more longer term perspective, first of all, I'd love to ask you, do you think it's possible through an AI powered system to prevent all harmful gambling in theory? Is that something that you guys are aspiring to? And if such a system would actually be produced one day, what will that mean for the industry at large?
Well, let me put it this way. I believe the AI and technology is a major contributing factor to rooting out gambling addiction. I believe that it would be doubtful to argue that gambling addiction can be completely stamped out and rooted out. Unfortunately, there will always be those who will suffer from this disease. So everything we can do to improve the situation across the industry, I believe, is extremely beneficial and should be applauded. So when it comes to AI, that's one element. We talked about what I would call the so-called human touch element, because to your previous point, I understand, because luckily I've never gone through that myself, so hopefully I'm not speaking out of tone here, but I understand from my discussions with recovered gambling addicts that it takes a lot of courage to come out and start talking about gambling addiction. And that's why we indeed train our customer service or RG agents to be able to have these conversations and to be able to help those who are unfortunately slipping down the slippery slope. So what I'm really trying to say is that AI technology will play, and has already played, a massive contributing factor, but we need to create an ecosystem that will reflect all the other factors, crucially and critically, including the human perspective. And that, I believe, is the way that will help us prevent gambling addiction as much as possible. And to make it circular, if I may, it goes back to my point about the industry wanting to cater to happy and healthy customers that can gamble responsibly. Because, and if I was cynical again, it's a good business strategy in itself. Now, you might have heard it from me, doing good gambling business is contingent upon doing good RG, because you don't want, or at least Entain doesn't want, other license operators, I know for a fact, they don't want customers to come to our sites or come to our venues, come to our betting shops, spend a lot of money in a couple of goes, and then burn up I think that would be a very, very silly, if I may put it that way, business strategy. Of course, hand in hand to bring it all together, everything we've so far discussed on this podcast, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Martin.
It is intimately linked with the black market, and that's where the regulators come in. Indeed, the likes of DGE of New Jersey, and for very good reason, have been lately laying even more emphasis on responsible gambling and cyber security. And this is part of the overall package designed to root out the black market operators who don't, and I'm putting it mildly, who don't really care about their customers. They are the ones, arguably, very arguably, that do intend and have rolled out business strategies whereby they're milking the cash cows, if I may use that analogy. Then customers burn out. Well, we've got other customers, so other customers will come. So the bottom line here is, I believe, that if the regulators, the licensed operators, and the customers, and the researchers and academics, if we all work together to make our offerings within that ecosystem that results from ideally workable pieces of regulation, that ecosystem allows for attractive offering without the need for excessive advertising, but offering that at the same time provides for all the necessary and efficient safeguards. I reckon, to answer your question finally, that's where we need to land. And that's why Entain and ARC, the tests have proven that ARC is working, that customers who would have been high risk or even very high risk, they paused, and that's what it's really about. They paused and thought about their behavior. They came back to the site, so they didn't run away to the black market. They came back, and they were prepared to be much more considerate about their gambling, depending also on the levels of affordability. They started much more frequently setting up limits and so on and so forth, mainly because they got the recommendation from the operator on the basis of their own individual behavior. Because another road to perdition, in my view, would be to try to impose on the operators, try to impose on the customer a set of statutory limits that would be completely out of kilter with the individual customer reality. So really what this is about, what ARC is about, is to further raise our game and the industry's game when it comes to providing individualized gambling addiction-related care and prevention.
Fair enough, Martin. Thank you for expanding on the responsible gambling subject a bit more, and the Entain's efforts here. Very interesting. Of course, an important subject, especially as the North American market grows exponentially. Of course, we need to make sure that we don't forget responsible gambling and the issues that can come with it. I have a question, if I may change subject a bit here. We mentioned earlier in the podcast, looking into the North American market and the various states. You mentioned here that 40 plus states could potentially open up by next year in total, and that is obviously for sports betting specifically. And you mentioned here earlier that the other segment here we're looking at is online gambling, so to say, where the states have been a lot slower to move, and presumably it's because of the cultural issues in the United States, where sports betting is a lot more culturally acceptable, whereas online gambling perhaps is frowned upon to a certain extent. And so I would like to ask you, Martin, here, what's your expectations on the state level and online gambling specifically? Do you think we'll see? Do you think we'll see most of the states that are opening for sports betting will eventually open for online gambling as well? Or what's your expectations in general on that vertical?
It has indeed been a slow burner, I believe. Eventually, most, and that's my perhaps even a guess or guesstimate, most of the states that have and will have regulated sports betting will either open or at least consider opening their online or launching their online casino and poker markets. Because I suppose even $1 billion, I wouldn't want to be putting a number on it. I'm but a dumb gambling attorney. I'm no economist, but that could be $1 billion question. To your point about sports betting, I believe indeed that sports betting is, including mobile and online sports betting, is much more, despite a very short regulated history it has had in the United States and elsewhere in the Americas, to be fair. It is, owing to its intimate connection with sport, deeply ingrained in the American culture. Whereas on the casino side of things, I think what most folks, and I'm relocated to the States 4 months ago, so I'm hopefully I'm not speaking out of tone again. But I reckon
you even
most
have an American
Americans,
accent these days.
well, let's see how that goes. That accent's been all over the place.
Yeah.
Anyway, I shall digress and go back to the answer.
Yeah.
Well, so one thing is the missing hype that's resulted from the intimate link between sport and betting, and sports betting, and the same, I reckon, will have gone for esports and video gaming. And also, to your point, indeed, traditionally, I believe most American folks would associate casino or playing poker with a land-based experience that in itself provides much more than just slot machines or roulette tables. You go to a casino for, I may put it that way, social experience. I reckon that's why it has been such a slow burner. I suppose the other reason being that, just like previously in Europe, the smaller local casinos, I believe, they may be a bit concerned about the arrival of the online casino behemoths in town. If I were to give them an assurance based on the European experience, and I hope you will agree with me, Pierre, the cannibalization fears have not proven to be true. I believe there's a lot of room for both land-based casinos and online casinos and poker halls and online poker. Because going back to the point I've just made, the retail casino, land-based casino is a totally different experience that doesn't even revolve around playing the game itself, whereas playing it online, well, that's what you do when you play that. So, cutting another very long story short, I believe eventually more, if not many more, than the current brave 6 states that have plucked up the courage to have regulated online casino and online poker. I believe that the number will grow. The 3 American eyes, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, they're looking into it. Again, let's see. It's not necessarily on the top of the agenda of those legislatures. But yes, to give you a brief answer, finally, I do believe that over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, the number of states to have regulated online casino and online poker will grow. Also bearing in mind, and I believe that is a critical contributing factor, and that is the fact that the industry has succeeded to fend off the Wire Act related challenge that has come out of the Trump administration, and I will not speculate as to, believe that's quite clear, as to who might have financed those efforts. But the bottom line is that the industry has won that litigation, which by implication means that there's a regulatory room for cross-nation liquidity, which is the fuel that especially online poker, but a number of online casino games, the likes of progressive jackpots, that they need to thrive. And that's an opportunity for the individual states and ultimately the industry to jump on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can say it for you here, Martin. If you obviously work for a high conglomerate, publicly listed company, but to give some history here to the iGaming podcast today, it's the legendary owner of Las Vegas Sands, the biggest gambling company in the world, Sheldon Adelson, who was the biggest contributor to the Trump administration, with a massive amount of donations in order to hold the efforts to legalize the online gambling sphere here. He passed away last year, and surprise, surprise, but very shortly after, Las Vegas Sands decided that they are now open to look at the online opportunity, albeit we're still waiting for Las Vegas Sands to make their move. And in hindsight, you could make the argument that by luck, perhaps, they have arguably made the right decision to wait, because they want to see, they want to wait before the dust has settled a bit before they make their move into online gambling here in the very chaotic market. So that is still kind of anyone's guess how things will turn out here. But that's essentially a little bit background here, at least on the state of play.
Indeed, a few quirky Sheldon Adelson, and don't get me wrong, I believe that he was a great entrepreneur, and he believed in his cause.
Absolutely.
And you got the other Sheldons, such as Sheldon Cooper, not necessarily a real life character, but yeah, everybody will be familiar with them. So there seems to be a theme, Las Vegas Sands, Big Bang Theory, and all that. Yeah, certain quirks to these great gentlemen.
We'll have to wait and see how things turns out. Let's say.
Absolutely.
let's say. So, I mean, to start with, we haven't even, Martin, gone through a third of the little outline that I made for us here today. And we talked about this before the podcast here. The 45 minutes that we have today is definitely not enough time when we get together here, Martin. But I'm going to ask you a final question here as well. In a way, we've been a little bit cynical here to the American opportunity today. We're talking about potential tax hikes in other states, potential slow growth on the online casino side of things, and obviously Florida now is having problems as well with delayed legislation on that side as well. So, if we summarize here today, Martin, the American opportunity and the American market. What is your long-term view on the American market? Do you think, from an operator point of view, that we'll start seeing the American opportunity being as... will it live up to the hype, essentially, do you think? What's your long-term view here?
If I may address your points one by one, first of all, I'll start by apologizing for the fact that I do love the sound of my voice a bit too much. So indeed, Pierre and I usually start running out of time. To address the other specific point about tax hikes, indeed, these occurrences have happened. At the same time, it's 3 states out of 30 that have regulated. We need to add Pennsylvania to that particular category with this 36% tax, but then the operators have made it work. So overall, the taxation level in all the other states, the Louisianas, the Michigans, the New Jerseys, the taxation is very, very sensible. And the regulation is getting ever more flexible to cater for future developments on the sports betting side of things. So you might know, especially in the likes of Tennessee or in Tennessee, a number of really hypey startups that may be very, very efficient, the likes of Wager and other companies have been launching. So that next to the big global or US-facing operators, that is the future. I think that will drive us towards a race towards the top, not the bottom. Invention, all the new creations, exciting products. And I reckon the regulation caters for it, and the taxation is still, again, brushing those 3 or 4 states aside, is still very welcoming. So I believe America is a huge opportunity, also into the fact that it's populated by 300 million plus sports avid fans. So that helps on the sports betting side of things. So I reckon as long as I will sound like a broken record again. As long as the industry is sensible, once we've tied ourselves over the initial stage whereby I would suggest I wouldn't use the word aggressive, I would use the word assertive, where we need to go assertively after customers, then as long as we behave sustainably, inbuild the consumer protection tenets and tools and principles into our offering, I believe the industry stands a very good chance to retain these customers and will be fueled by these customers and desire for a better product to take it up much more than a couple of notches. So the bottom line in my view is that the US markets have a great future if we're sensible about how we're approaching them. And as I've already pointed out, on the online casino side of things, it's been still slow burning. And I may be wrong, but to use my previous analogy, I don't necessarily expect a big bang. And from that point onwards, 30 plus, 20 plus states would jump on the bandwagon. But I reckon if we get a critical mass, then slowly but surely we will get there as well. Because there is a huge customer segment that we can cater to. Customer segment who would still very likely be going to the land-based casinos, but they may want to have the opportunity to gamble in their way on their mobile phones. So overall, I believe we're firmly on the journey towards success, just like any other journey. It can be occasionally rocky and bumpy, but we need to continue working very hard to make sure that we will reach that nirvana, I'll say it again, but whereby we're in a place where we have attractive offering of both sports betting and online casino, but offering that is not only attractive but also sustainable by means of offering due levels of consumer protections. I think that's where we are headed, and that's where we most definitely need to go in the United States, but also elsewhere in the Americas. We haven't, to your other point, we haven't even touched upon the likes of Ontario, Brazil, Chile, all these upcoming regulations. So hopefully, if of interest, we can do it next time.
Absolutely, Martin. Well, the industry is certainly lucky to have you as a positive force for sustainability here as we go forward. And you're absolutely right. We'll have to follow up on all these other exciting bullet points that we didn't cover here today, like Canada, for example, and Europe as well. We shouldn't forget either. But in the meantime as well, Martin, you will be in New York as well in May here. So for the viewers and listeners who are checking us out here today, if you want to hear more or meet Martin more, then obviously New York is the place to do that in May as well. So I'm looking forward to see you there as well. And thank you for coming on today. And I'm going to leave the last word with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre, for inviting me to your great New York event. Indeed, New York City is the place to be, and it might be the new, although my friends from New Jersey will hate me for saying that the jury's still out, but the New Yorkers do believe that they are the new mecca for mobile sports betting, and we will be discussing that at the May event. And thanks for having me on the podcast. It's always a pleasure. I appreciate the truly civilized and very pleasant discussion, and hopefully I've contributed to further developing the fame of this podcast, because that's what it truly deserves. So thanks again for having me.
Yes, you definitely have a good fan base, Martin. That's for sure. We can't deny that either. So thank you for that, Martin. And I'll see you in New York in May, and take care of you until then. And we absolutely have to follow up soon as well. Take care, Martin.
Thank you very much. Take good care. Always a pleasure.